Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome to reacting to every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet. Episode, what is it, number 9? Episode 9. Oh my goodness. We're almost at double digits. That is absolutely insane. How we doing, guys? How are we doing today? Let me know what's the emoji that represents your day today. My day has been pretty busy. Definitely. That's been my day, sending out a lot of messages and things of that sort. But hey, we're here. We are thriving. And today, as you saw in the thumbnail, Alex is doing something different. He's doing something unique in that he is critiquing an atheistic standpoint. Specifically, he's critiquing morality and a sort of objective sense of morality from an atheistic standpoint. People like Sam Harris, and in this video, Rationality Rules, they advocate for an objective perspective of morality, whereas Alex himself believes morality to be subjective. Even to this day, he sees it as subjective. And so it's interesting because Alex is coming here to debunk an atheist of all people. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty crazy to see that. But as always, let's check in. Let's see where are we at in our goal in terms of watching every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet. So far, we have watched, here we are. So far, on my own, I have watched, actually, this should be 118 videos. And together, we have watched 20 videos. So we made it. Good job. Give yourselves a round of applause. Good job. Pat on the back. 20 videos. And in total, I haven't updated this. It's probably another like 10 or so videos on top of this, but about 376 videos in total. So we're getting there. We are approaching the goal slowly but surely. Hopefully reach it within a year. But yeah, today specifically we are talking about Alex debunking a famous atheist. Rationality Rules. What are your thoughts? What's your perspective on morality? What kind of morality do you hold to specifically? And why? What are some of your reasons for holding to that? I know Alex advocates for a subjective morality, not just because he's an atheist, but because he believes that morality at its core, by definition, is subjective. It cannot be objective, which is an interesting standpoint. So let me pull this up here. Here it is. It says that I watched it already. I have not watched this yet, but oh, you know what? I pulled the thumbnail from the video, so that's what was happening. So, but yeah, here it is. Rationality Rules, morality debunked. Is it debunked? We will see. We shall see. So I saw in the chat, James said, I'd be surprised if Alex can debunk Steven, at least on anything that really matters. That's a hot take. Alex is a smart guy. He's a pretty smart guy, but so is Steven. So I respect it. It'll be interesting. I've seen some debates between them earlier on in this series, on this subject specifically. Steven kind of thinks of morality in terms of health. He uses an example that Sam Harris often uses, which is that morality is similar to health in that when we say things are healthy, it is with the subjective lens of or medication, and like healthcare is subjective in the sense that, anything can be sort of considered healthy, but it depends on the metric at which you are striving toward. If that metric is toward well-being, then it can be thought of in an objective sense. But you can think of healthcare in a whole variety of different senses. And so he says, you can be very, strongly critiquing it in that sense, or you can just take it in the sense that pretty well everyone already agrees upon. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see Alex's thoughts. Can he indeed debunk Rationality Rules? Let me know in the comments below. I'm going to start a poll here. Do you think that Alex will debunk Stephen? What are your thoughts? Yes? No? And maybe. All right, poll is out. Send me your votes. Do you think that Alex will actually debunk Rationality Rules in this video, or do you think this is a hoax? Heck no. Alex is not that smart. Come on now. We shall see. We shall see. So while you are doing that, I say we get into this thing. Let me know in the comments below, what exactly do you think are the topics that are going to be brought up? I mentioned a few that I think will probably be brought up, specifically on the topic of objective morality versus subjective morality. The notion of like what is actually at the core behind morality as an entity. Alex currently has more of a emotivist view of morality, where it is an emotional thing rather than an actual tangible thing. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you do that, I say we get into this thing. Rationality Rules, debunked by Alex O'Connor. Here we go.
They're hanged. Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and Stephen, I hope you forgive me for the title of this video. I simply couldn't help myself. Today, I want to respond to Stephen's Rationality Rules. His recent video called My Views on Morality is an interesting and unique take, but I think it fails for a fairly specific reason. Stephen and I have privately discussed morality at length and have some long-standing disagreements, and I thought it would be fruitful to make some of these discrepancies public. Now, Stephen advocates for the idea that morality is objective, that there are facts that can be known about ethics, and that ethical statements are propositions that contain truth value. He thinks that there are moral facts. I've always maintained a non-cognitivist approach, believing that morality is entirely subjective and has no basis in analytical or empirical facts. Stephen's video attempts to show how moral facts can be derived, and because I only want to address specific points and there is a considerable level of agreement between us, I won't be responding to the entire video, but I disagree with his ultimate conclusion, and of course the link to Stephen's full video is in the description, and I'd recommend watching it fully to understand mine. So to outline his moral ideas, Stephen begins by identifying the classic problem with trying to prove moral truths. That's the is-ought distinction attributed to David Hume. Essentially, this is an observation that statements about how things are can never inform statements about how things should be. Hume defines two types of statements. First, statements like X is the case, and second, statements like X ought to be the case. Hume writes that you can say X is the case, Y is the case, Z is the case, and you can keep going, but you'll never arrive at an ought. You can't say this is the case, and therefore you ought to do this, because you're making a leap from description to prescription. I'll let Stephen explain.
For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1, humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2, Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken. This looks like a valid deductive argument, but it's not. It's a non sequitur. Even with both premises being true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. It attempts to get a prescriptive statement from descriptive facts, but it fails. Sure, humans tend to die if hanged, and Ken is indeed a human, but how exactly do these statements of fact tell us that we ought not to hang Ken? Exactly, they don't.
They don't because whilst it is the case that Ken will die if we hang him, we can't prove that this is a bad thing to do, that we ought not do it. That's an extra assumption that requires its own justification, and there's no amount of descriptive facts that could provide this justification. They're all is statements and have nothing to do with how we ought to behave. So far,
it's an interesting idea, the idea of the ought, because in sort of Christian perspective and religious perspective for a lot of people who view morality in an objective sense, the ought is very important because the ought, you can also think of it in terms of duty versus values, a different debate that Alex participates in versus inspiring philosophy. basically discusses this, which is from a Christian perspective, a lot of morality is based upon duty, right? You have a duty to do this thing, and if you don't, then that's wrong and that's bad. You have a duty to do what's good, and you have a duty to avoid what's bad. And then outside of that are values, things that are like good for you to do, but like not necessary, right? And they discuss this idea of like, is it a good thing? Is it morally good for you to be a doctor, right? Yeah, it would be a morally good thing to choose to be a doctor, but is it a moral duty? Like, you are required to become a doctor. No, that is not a moral duty. And so there is a distinction where the ought is like, you ought to do this, whereas a value is more that you should do this, right? And so that's another piece of the puzzle that plays in here that is often ignored, I think, in these sort of atheistic discussions of morality, because morality is tended to be seen as a product of evolution. And so as, beings evolve, they realize what works for survivability and reproduction and what doesn't work for survivability and reproduction. And from there, this sense of morality occurs. It stems out from that. And so it's this idea of like what works and what doesn't work versus what you must do that is ordained and given to you by the nature of life itself. The universe, in a sense, dictates you must do this and you must not do that. Versus a value system, which is I have come to these objective sense of values from the evolutionary timeline. I've inherited it from the evolutionary timeline of events. So it's an important distinction. Now here, Alex is getting at this idea that just because this is how morality is, doesn't mean that it must be that way, right? And so that's kind of the more precise distinction here in this video. So we'll see how that plays out in the rest of it.
This all sounds perfectly agreeable to me, but Stephen, and this is where the divergence occurs, Stephen says that you can get to an ought in the conclusion of an argument. He just says that you have to do it differently. So let's see what he means. But first, a definition. A deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, then it logically follows that the conclusion must also be true. For example, premise 1, all cats are black. Premise 2, Tom is a cat. Conclusion, Tom is black. Obviously this argument is wrong because the first premise is wrong, but it's still deductive because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. There's no way that it could be false. Stephen thinks that it's possible to produce a sound deductive argument with true premises that has an ought in the conclusion, but doesn't try to get an ought from an is. Now, let me be clear. If Stephen can produce a sound deductive argument with an ought in the conclusion that doesn't derive from an is, I will change my mind and believe morality to be objective immediately. He wins the argument because the conclusion would have to be true. So let's see the rather fascinating way Stephen tries to do this.
Let's quickly check on the poll here real quick. So so far, the consensus is, does Alex debunk Stephen here? Maybe. We will see. I will see how that maybe changes throughout this video. So feel free to drop a vote in that poll. Do you think Alex will debunk Stephen on morality in this video? So far, y'all are a little undecisive. I would say I would probably agree with you on maybe, but to be decisive, I would probably say no. I don't think he's going to. But so far, he does bring up an interesting point. The ought is sort of contention. So I think that's a very good point from Alex. So if he keeps kind of going down these solid arguments here, I think he might win it out. We'll see.
How then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought. For example,
Monday.com, the opposite of any work platform we tried in the past. We tried other work management platforms, not named.
Premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an ought. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat.
So, Stephen wants to get an ought from an ought. In other words, the is-ought problem is avoided by including an ought in the premises, rather than having the premises consisting of only is statements. We've seen that you can't get an ought from an is, sure, but you can definitely get an is from an is, and you can also get an ought from an ought. Okay, interesting. But your first question should be this: how can you know that a premise involving an ought is true? Sure, an ought premise could inform an ought conclusion, but you'd need to prove that the ought statement in the premise is correct. The example Stephen just gave is a clever one because it has an ought premise that most people would consider to be untrue, and this identifies the problem. You can't just stick an ought in the premises, you have to make sure that the ought premise that you're proposing is actually correct. In order to produce a good deductive argument, the ought premise must be justified so that we can use it to inform our ought conclusion. So how does Stephen say that we can do this? How can we produce an ought premise that we know is true? Well, he makes a distinction of his own. Stephen says that there are in fact two types of oughts. He calls them axiomatic oughts.
Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature.
And contingent oughts.
And contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct.
In other words, there are some oughts that are a product of other information. You ought to do this because of this. But there's also a classification of oughts that are just true in their own right. You ought to do this, full stop. This second type is what he calls an axiomatic ought. This axiomatic contingent ought distinction is similar but not the same as Kant's hypothetical and categorical imperatives. The idea is this: you can't have a contingent ought in your premises because they're not self-evidently true, and so you can't know for sure if the premise is correct. However, you can have an axiomatic ought in your premises because these require no justification or proof. They're simply true. And if these ought statements are self-evidently true and we can know them to be true, then we can use them in our premises in order to get an ought in our conclusion. We can derive moral facts. Now, Stephen is absolutely right in that if there really are such things as axiomatic oughts, oughts that are true as a fact of nature, then we can construct a deductive moral argument and show that there are such things as objective moral facts. So I want to demonstrate why I think that the argument that Stephen presents for the existence of axiomatic oughts is flawed, and why I think that what he's calling axiomatic oughts are actually not what he makes them out to be. Of course, these ideas are unique to Stephen, and I may have misunderstood them or missed something important, but hopefully if that is the case, then this video can help prevent others from making the same mistakes. Otherwise, the key point is this: I agree with Stephen that you can't get an ought from an is. I agree that you need an ought in the premises to get an ought in the conclusion. I just don't think that you can do it. I agree that if axiomatic oughts do exist, then you can use them in your premises and morality can be objective. I just don't think that they do exist. If I'm wrong about this one single thing, the existence of axiomatic oughts, my entire criticism crumbles. So let's jump into why I'm not convinced by Stephen's description of them, using his examples as much as possible.
So this is good. This is basically him saying, hey, you can test my thought here by this one thing. And that one thing is, can there be such a thing as an axiomatic ought? Meaning that it just is that people must act in a certain way. It's not just that we do act in a certain way, but that we must act in a certain way. And I think, I don't know if this is where they're getting at, but maybe a good example of this is in terms of necessity, right? So in philosophy, for something to be necessary, it means that in every possible world, it is true, right? So for instance, it is necessarily true that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Because in every conceivable world that you could live in, 2 + 2 always equals 4, right? That's just by definition, that's what it is. And there's no sort of getting around that, right? So we know that that is objectively true. That would be an axiomatic fact in the sense of how they're defining the word. So the question now is, okay, Stephen is claiming that there are axiomatic oughts, axiomatic moral truths in the world. And that it's not just that we happen to believe this to be true, but that in every possible world, this moral ought is always the case. It's always so, right? And so that's what must be tested. Is that true? If it is, then Stephen is correct, and Alex does not debunk him. But if it's false, then Alex does debunk Stephen. So it's great. This gives us a clear way of being able to debunk or not debunk. So yeah, this is great. I love this. Here we go. Oh, wrong button. There we go.
And if I seem to be repeating myself or overdoing a point, it's because this is quite a confusing topic, and I want to ensure that we're all on the same page.
Actually,
one quick thing I didn't mention this. A way that we could get an axiomatic ought, I don't know if this is what Stephen will say, but a way we could is if we could somehow show that the evolutionary process is necessary. So it's always going to be the case in every possible world. And second, that the evolutionary process will always lead to certain moral truths. If both of those are true, then there would be axiomatic oughts, in my opinion. Maybe I'm missing something, but that seems to be the case. So we have to prove, I guess, two things here, in my perspective, that evolution is necessary. It's not just possible, but necessary to every possible world. And second, that it is always going to lead to certain moral truths. If you can prove both of those, then you could prove objective morality.
axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought. I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption.
So here's where I see the confusion. Stephen is saying that it's an axiomatic ought that he ought to survive because he simply has that ought innately within him. But here's the thing, you don't have the ought to survive. You have a conviction that you ought to survive. When Stephen talks about axiomatic oughts, I think he's really talking about what could be called axiomatic desires. It's not that we innately ought to survive, it's that we innately feel as though we ought to survive. Now, he's right to say that you, quote, just have it. I think he's right that none of us reason our way into wanting to survive. We just do. This is a fact of nature. It's true that we want to survive. You could call this an axiomatic desire or an axiomatic predisposition. You just can't call it an axiomatic ought. Axiomatic means self-evident and unquestionable, and so to call the ought to survive an axiomatic ought means that it's self-evident and undeniable, an undeniable fact that we ought to survive. But
one thing he said there, and I'm going to be very precise here, axiomatic does not mean that it's unquestionable. You can question axioms. It just leaves basically an open door to not being able to discuss or do anything in your life, right? So like an axiom is that I exist, right? Or I perceive my senses, right, of the world around me are accurate. Or that something like language and my understanding of language is true, that I actually do receive language, I interpret it accurately, and all of that. We sort of assume that those things are true. And we have good reasons to believe that they are true, but we don't know for a fact that they are true. So that's why they're axioms, because we have to sort of assume that we exist. We have to assume that other people exist. We have to assume that language is real. We have to assume that math is true and that our calculations of math are absolutely true. You can possibly question them, right? But it's that we have to just assume that they're true in order to function. Otherwise, you can't discuss anything and you can't actually move forward. This is why when people question logic and say that, logic coming from materialism is faulty because it shows that logic is something that is subjective, potentially. And so, or at least we can't fully trust it. And so that's an axiom. We have to trust logic in order to get anywhere. And so it's not that we can't question it. It's that we can't, I guess in a sense, we shouldn't question it in order to come to any sort of conclusion. If you want to come to a conclusion, you can't question these sort of things.
I think Stephen is confusing the ought to survive with the belief that we ought to survive. Let me explain further. There is an axiomatic quality in the idea of survival. Remember, axiomatic means undeniably or self-evidently true. Our evolutionary history has tuned us into creatures that have a desire to survive. This is the axiomatic part that I think Stephen might be skirting around and confusing for something else. It's undeniably true that human beings have an innate desire to survive, since if our species had no desire to survive, it simply wouldn't have, and natural selection would have made us extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. As Stephen alludes to, we didn't reason ourselves into this. It's genetic, it's evolutionary, printed into the fiber of our DNA, the conviction that survival is preferable. But here's the thing. Whilst it may be axiomatically true that human beings feel as though they ought to survive, that doesn't make it axiomatically true that they ought to survive. As I've just explained, it's undeniable that human beings are born with a desire to survive, but just because we innately desire survival, it doesn't follow that it's innately true that survival is good or that we ought to survive. That's a separate claim. And this is the heart of my problem with the idea of axiomatic oughts as Stephen, if I correctly understand him, is presenting. We have to be careful not to confuse facts about holding a belief and facts about the belief itself. For instance, it's a fact that John believes Oxford University to be superior to Cambridge University. Is Oxford actually better than Cambridge? It doesn't matter. Even if John's wrong and Oxford isn't better than Cambridge, it's still a fact that he believes that Oxford is better than Cambridge. That's a fact about John holding the belief, not a fact about John's belief itself. So let's take a less subjective example. Let's say that John also believes the Earth is flat. It's true that John believes the Earth is flat. Obviously, this can be true at the same time as the Earth not actually being flat in reality, and that's because whilst his belief itself is false, the fact that he believes it is true. It's true that he holds the belief even if the belief itself is false. This is the key point, and that's why I'm pressing it. So now let's take Stephen's example. The belief is this: I ought to survive. I'll play something again for you. Stephen says this.
An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought. I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption.
And he's right. It is a fact of nature that he has the compulsion to survive. It is an axiomatic fact that he believes that he should survive. But pay attention, this is a fact about holding the belief, not the belief itself. It may be a fact of nature that Stephen believes he ought to survive, but it's not a fact of nature that he ought to survive. The only thing that can be axiomatically true is that he holds the belief. This is a fact about his brain, his psychology, but it doesn't follow, however, that the belief itself is therefore axiomatically true.
Now that might seem dissatisfying.
Okay, so how are we doing in the poll real quick? Let me check up with the poll. So far, okay, everyone is saying maybe. Maybe. He debunks him. So far, I think he actually makes a very good point, which is the is-ought. I mean, this is basically stemming on the is-ought sort of idea here. Is morality something that ought to be? Like you ought to do these things. Or is it just that it happens to be this way? Another question, though, is that if morality always leads in every possible world to the same thing, might we just assume that that is also an ought? I mean, I'm not an expert on philosophy, but if there's no possible world in which morality, like these specific moral traits, like I ought to survive, if that is never going to be different in any possible world, then might we just say that it is objective, right? I don't know. I'm not trained enough on philosophy here. So if you guys have pushback, let me know. But to me, that seems to be the case. Like, if it's always possible in every possible world to be true, it's necessarily true that morality or this sense of a desire to survive will always play out. Might that just be an objective fact then? I don't know if I phrased that well enough, so I don't know. Also, if you're liking this content, give it a like, give it some hearts too. More people can see it and enjoy it. So thanks for tuning in. But yeah, let's continue on with this. Let me know your thoughts below.
But so too, at least in my opinion, are all axiomatic facts. While it's not justified, it really is the case that I have this compulsion, this awe, this impulse, this urge to behave in a certain way, and this can be objectively verified through the scientific method, and so it's a scientific fact. And what's more, thanks to Darwin, we now know precisely why I have it in the first place.
This is all true, of course. It's true that you have this compulsion. It's true that we can explain why you have this compulsion. It's true that most people in the world share this compulsion. But none of this makes the compulsion itself true. It doesn't make it false, it just doesn't say anything about the truth content of the belief itself. It's true that you believe you ought to survive, but that's not the same as it being true that you ought to survive. So now, with that, I want to show why I think this specific confusion leads to the downfall of Stephen's ethical framework. Remember, ultimately, Stephen is trying to show that you can have a deductive moral argument where the conclusion includes an ought. Let's quickly refresh the problem with this. You can't get an ought from an is. The deductive argument can't only have is statements for premises if it wants to have an ought in the conclusion. As Stephen explained, this would be a non sequitur. In order to get an ought in the conclusion, there must be at least one ought in the premises, allowing you to get an ought from an ought. Stephen does this with the following example.
Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that vaccinating my child will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to vaccinate my child.
He later says that this argument is, quote, correct because its premises are correct. So this is crucial. This is a deductive argument, and so yes, if those premises are both correct, then the conclusion is true. We can have an ought in the conclusion because there's an ought in the first premise. But are the premises true? Well, premise 2 certainly is. It's a fact of science that vaccinations reduce the chances of suffering. But take a look at the first premise. This is an example of one of Stephen's axiomatic oughts, an ought that's self-evident and undeniable. But now let's apply my criticism that Stephen confuses facts about holding a belief and facts about the belief itself. It may be a fact, an axiomatic fact if you will, that a parent innately believes that they ought to prevent their child from suffering, but that doesn't make it a fact that they ought to do so. When Stephen says, quote, nature has made it so that we're born with axiomatic oughts, it seems to me that what he really means is that nature has made it so that we're born with axiomatic beliefs, including beliefs about how we ought to behave. Parents do naturally believe that they ought to prevent their child from suffering, but that doesn't make it true that they ought to do so. So in light of this, we can adapt the first premise of Stephen's argument. Really, it should read, Premise 1, I hold the belief that I ought to prevent my child from suffering. This is the fact of nature. This is the axiomatic belief that's innate within us. Premise 2, vaccinating my child will reduce the chances of suffering. In conclusion, I ought to vaccinate my child. Do you see the problem here? Based on what Stephen has explained he means by axiomatic oughts, we've actually transformed the first premise from an ought statement into an is statement. The word ought is still in the premise, but don't let that confuse you. The fact isn't that I ought to prevent my child from suffering. The fact is that I believe this to be the case. It's like having a premise that says, John believes blue is the best colour. This may be true, but that doesn't make it true that blue is the best colour. It's true that parents believe that they ought to prevent their children from suffering, but that doesn't make it true that parents ought to prevent their children from suffering. The first premise is now just a plain old is statement. So remember, we said that in order to have an ought statement...
So I think maybe a counterexample is probably helpful in understanding this. I mean, they've nailed this down a lot, but it is kind of a complicated thing. So something that Alex is using in a different conversation is he uses, and he kind of mentioned it earlier, but he uses the color blue. So say that the color blue like my mic, is just considered by everyone around the entire world. It's not even argued by anyone, but it's just considered to be the best color. And it's also considered to be something that you should paint your house blue. You should do this, and you should have, if you have the ability to have a car or have something, a cup, right? Have something in your life, you should have it in the color blue. Otherwise, it's kind of nasty or gross or bad, right? That's obviously not the case, but let's just say that that's the case for everyone and everyone agrees upon it. Does that automatically make it so? Does that make it that you ought to see the world as it should be blue and see the color blue as superior to all colors? Does that make it a moral truth? Well, we know that it's possible, because in our world it's possible that the color blue is not like forcefully so to be seen and believed as the most supreme and best color, because it isn't, right? There's a lot of people in our world today who don't see blue as the best color. Comment below. Do you see blue as the best color? Because I do. I love blue. Blue and red, baby. But but anyway, maybe it is an objective fact. I don't know. But I think what we can kind of see from this is that just because it's sort of commonly agreed upon by everyone that this is true, like that we ought to survive, it's agreed upon by everyone, it doesn't automatically mean that we ought to survive. It just means that it is true that we feel we ought to survive. That's the is-ought distinction. It's not that we ought to survive based upon every possible world, but that it's just true that that everyone agrees that we should survive. And that's something that's intuitive to us. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I think the color blue analogy is very, very helpful in making that distinction.
In the conclusion, you must have an ought statement in the premises. Now, Stephen has tried to do this by describing so-called axiomatic oughts that can be put in a premise without need for justification. But I hope that I've shown somewhat clearly enough why I think his axiomatic oughts are actually just facts about holding beliefs, and ultimately are just is statements, meaning that they can't in fact inform a moral conclusion. It's worth noting, of course, that this doesn't mean that the premises "I ought to survive" or "I ought to prevent my child from suffering" are false. They may well be correct. But contrary to Stephen's claim, I just don't think that they're self-evidently correct, axiomatically correct. The only thing we do know to be true is the fact that people believe these things, not that the beliefs themselves are correct. If someone can find another way to show that these ought statements are correct, then we can use them in our premises. But claiming that they're just correct by nature and that we know this because we all feel deeply that this is the case, which is essentially what I think Stephen is trying to do, just doesn't cut it for me. Until you can justifiably show that these ought statements are correct in a way that doesn't ultimately derive from an is, and isn't simply the statement that they're just correct and that's that because we feel that way, we're stuck with the problem of never being able to derive moral facts and can't make any claim to their objectivity. Stephen's argument that you can get an ought from an ought is absolutely true, and if he can find a way to get an ought statement into his premises and justify that ought statement, then as far as I can see, his theory holds. But according to my understanding, Stephen hasn't proved that his ought statements are true. He's just appealed to nature, to the fact that people believe that these ought statements are true. His whole argument relies on the idea that there are such things as axiomatic oughts, and so if this turns out to be a confused or fallacious notion, the argument fails. So ultimately, the main point of this video, the takeaway, is this. Even if it's true that you believe that you ought to do X, that doesn't mean it's true that you ought to do X. You could be wrong. You can always be wrong. And in the spirit of fairness, so could I. I could be wrong about all of this, and if there's one person I think is capable of just devastating my ethical ideas, it's Stephen, so I'll be eagerly awaiting his reaction to what I've said, and if I am wrong, I can hopefully make a future video explaining what my mistakes were. I hope this response hasn't been too in-depth for your taste, but equally I realise that I've repeated the same point quite a lot in this video just to ensure that people really understand what I'm saying and to drive the point home, so I hope I didn't bore or patronise you either. If any of you want some clarification or want me to respond to a different facet of Stephen's philosophy, then you can of course let me know in the comments. Stephen, if you're watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and to everyone else, I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can find me on social media here. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I will see you in the next one. Yeah, that was a fascinating one. So the question is, did he actually debunk him? What are your thoughts? Do you think his argument holds? I'm going to put a poll out. All right, poll is out. Did it actually happen? Did Alex actually end up debunking a fellow atheist? Or is he full of crap? Is he full of crap? I don't know. Well, he is, because he's a human being. You know, everyone's full of crap in the literal sense. So, yes, I think it's so fascinating to kind of see this discussion happening. So go ahead and vote. Do you think Alex actually debunked Stephen or not? I personally think he did. I didn't see the full video. I wish Alex. I mean, I understand he doesn't want to show the whole video because that just takes a long time and is probably not fully relevant. So maybe we can watch Rationality Rules video if I can find it. But I think the main thing that is really solid is his definitions here. He helps us better understand what is the is-ought distinction and how we can actually understand that. He broke it down fairly well, and based upon what little he showed from Stephen's video, I think, yes, it's definitely true. He debunked him. This is clearly not an argument of what ought to be done, but an argument of what happens to be true, what is true currently from based upon just what is, what people believe, I guess. So it definitely, yeah, but he gets into the distinction of axioms, and technically axioms are just things we sort of assume to be true in order to come to any sort of conclusion. And so might this be one of those scenarios where we have to just assume that it's just true that we ought to survive in every possible world? That we must assume that in order to survive and think and actually do anything. I'm starting to confuse myself. I get in this loop of talking philosophy, and I'm like, wait a second. Am I getting anywhere right now? Let me know. Do you guys relate to that in the comments below? It's like, hold up. Wait a second. Is that true? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. While you vote, it is time for us to leave a comment. So we can be thinking about what kind of comment do we want to leave for Mr. Alex O'Connor. And with that video, it also marks that we have watched 21 videos together. And I have watched 119 videos. I just realized I'm like almost 100 videos more. That's crazy. I didn't realize that. But in the US, if our live stream in terms of videos watched were a living agent, we would be able to drink. Come on now. Yay. Let's give a cheers to that. We are of drinking age in terms of videos watched. Good job, y'all. Good job. Yeah, that one was definitely a fascinating one. He got into a lot of a lot of topics that I think are probably what's the word? He repeated himself a lot. So that was interesting, but I don't know. Let's get some what's the word? Inspiration. Let's get some inspiration from one of these comments. So this is what Steven said in response. Pleasure to watch, my friend. Great video. I'll do my best to respond within the month. Keep being awesome, Alexander. Hey, he called him Alexander. The respect. The respect. Gorgeous, gorgeous. I like this comment. That escalated reasonably. Bold of you to assume I want to survive. That's I mean, that's an interesting one. So when people say that everyone wants to survive, I think there is this sort of mindset of, well, what about suicide, right? What about people who choose to not continue to live and choose to take their life? And those are, very serious situations, and those are real. People who actually just don't want to continue living, and people feel that way. But does that mean that they didn't have this sort of intuition inside of themselves that wanted to survive, like, ever? And I would say that they did. They did have that intuition up until the point in which, sadly, they had the desire to take their life. And that's what ended up happening. Or maybe, hopefully, didn't happen. You can still have that feeling and not give in. But it's not that there can be a desire opposing it, but that intrinsically, whenever we are alive, whenever we are born, we all have this desire to survive, right? This is why when we're babies, we cry, and we want, like when we're first born, we cry in order to breathe. We cry in order to get food. We cry when, we are, using the bathroom in our diaper and we need to be changed, like all of those things happen from a very young age. Before we can even logic ourselves into thinking that we want to survive, we are actively doing things to survive, which means it's intrinsically true. It just is the case that we want to survive. Now, life and experience can maybe change that, but that doesn't mean that that was never there to begin with. So that's kind of what people mean when they say we all want to survive. We all have this sort of intrinsically born with, and like this would be why beings that don't want to survive wouldn't survive, because they wouldn't eat. They wouldn't, choose to, to have good hygiene and to clean themselves in the most basic sense, basic hygiene. So yeah, no, it's definitely something that I think we can agree on if we understand what we mean when we say we all have the desire to survive. But it is a real thing, and that people experience not wanting to survive. An earnest discussion with logical arguments between intellectuals. Bah, do a rap battle. Oh, I love that one. Give that one a like. My wife recently sent me to the supermarket. She said, bring home 1 liter of milk. A liter. Ooh, the metric system. Let me know. Do you use the metric system where you're at? We don't here in the US. We're weird. Anyway, and if they have eggs, then bring 6. As a good husband, I brought home 6 liters of milk. Ooh, that's spicy right there. That's spicy. Man, some good comments here. Feel free to vote. I have a poll out. Do you think Alex debunked Steven in this video? And if you're just tuning in, we just watched a video where Alex O'Connor supposedly debunks Rationality Rules. So, I personally think he did. But let me know. What are your thoughts below? Vote. And let me hear your perspective. All right, I think it's time to leave the comment. I'm going to copy my little handy dandy little intro over here. And let me know what are the types of things that stuck out to you in that video. I mean, the main point, the is-ought distinction, and it's a very important distinction. And I think Alex did a pretty good job of describing it. Based upon what little was shown, I would say, that there is an is-ought fallacy going on here, where Stephen is saying that these things, like the desire to keep your child alive, that is strong, and it's probably something we all feel. To say that that's an ought, and it's necessarily true that all humans must feel that way in every possible world, that I think goes a tinge too far. So far, yes is winning out with the votes, has 100% of the votes. Okay. Does anyone think that he's wrong? Does anyone think I'm wrong? Let me know, because I could always be wrong. All right. But yeah, the is-ought distinction seemed to be the main thing, so I'll probably say something like that. All right. How we doing? So with, I guess we have still 100% of the votes saying yes. If you have not voted, let me know. Do you think that Alex in this last video debunked rationality rules about morality? Is morality objective or is it subjective? According to Alex, it's subjective. And it's going to be subjective no matter your worldview. Even if God exists, it's still subjective, according to Alex. And with this sort of is-ought distinction, I think that makes sense, because we can't really show that morality is, it's just how it is. All we can see is what is, and we can't necessarily see that it ought to be that way, that in another possible world, morality could potentially work out and be something different. I think if we can maybe show that evolution must always lead to the conclusion of well-being, that beings who participate in the evolutionary process will always end up holding to the belief that they must survive and reproduce, and that well-being must be sort of targeted toward. I think if that's the case, then you could potentially say that morality is objective, and I would probably agree with Stephen here. But based upon what Alex said, I would say I think he did debunk him. So, wow, we got a no. We got a no. So who voted no? Let me know. Let me know who voted no, and why. Why do you think that's the case? All right. Currently, we're sitting at 67% yes, he did debunk him, and 33% no, he didn't debunk him. I'm with you guys. I with the yeses, but if you're the one no, you're welcome. I love the controversy. Let me know. Let me know. Hello, Jared. Welcome. I just got done with a Bible study. Perfect. That's awesome. What'd you guys study? You can just let me know in the chat. So, I'm going to give the poll just another minute for you guys to respond to. So, And if there's anything you'd like to add to this comment, let me know. In the comment, I said, "Hey, Alex, this is Jackson from the Truth and Tradition podcast. I am on a mission to watch every one of your videos and leave a comment on each and every one of them. Thanks for the breakdown. My audience was persuaded." Well, I mean, I guess that has to be said. There's still one of you who thinks no, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. They originally thought you wouldn't be able to debunk Stephen, and by the end of it, they said you did. So great work convincing them. The is-ought distinction is a tricky one, and you explained it well. I'm going to give it a little fist bump. Fist bump! Ka-chow. Fist bump. All right, I'm gonna post it if y'all are cool with that. So that's where you're at. Yeah, no worries. Thanks for being here, Jared. It's great to have you. Great to have you here. All right, I'm gonna end the poll here, and we can move on to the next video. Which I'm not actually sure what the next video is. Let me look. I was trying to get a lot of his next few videos are just podcasts, and so they're all like super long. That last one was one of the shorter ones. And so I was kind of happy about that. So I'm going to see if I can find another shorter one, quote unquote short, for Alex O'Connor is 20 minutes. So that's, still pretty long for a lot of people, especially if you're a shorts YouTuber or something like that. Okay. Yeah. So these all are pretty long, hour 7, 51 minutes. We watched that last week, which was really cool, about Islam and, basically Alex's first take on Islam. We got the next few. These are all pretty long. Okay, here we are. Actually, I was excited to dig into this one. It looked pretty interesting. Discussing things for my theology degree. So for context, Alex is now at this point in his career is at Oxford. He's in his first year at Oxford, and he's studying. Not just philosophy, that's what he majors in, but he's also minoring in theology. And so here, he's going to be discussing some theological things that he's learning at Oxford, and specifically things that are disgusting to him. That's quite the take. So I'm very interested. What do you think will be disgusting, Alex, here? What are the disgusting theological takes going on here? We shall see. Let me know in the comments below. And here we go.
Hey, I'm selling new merchandise with new designs. Check out the link in the description. I've also got events coming up in London, Cambridge, and Winchester very soon, all down below. It's really verging on a...
Also, what was I going to say? I totally just lost my train of thought. Totally just lost it. Well, if it comes back to me, I will let you know. Sorry.
Cliche at this point on this channel to open with, it's been a while, but, well, there, I've said it now. But it's good to be back. You'll know this if you follow me on Twitter and or Instagram, but if you don't, I just finished my first year studying philosophy and theology at Oxford University. Ooh. Many people have asked what it's like to study theology as an atheist, and it's actually wonderful. I have nothing but appreciation for my excellent tutors. And a modern theology degree is technically a theology and religion degree and is suitably secular in its nature. It feels more like studying religion than studying God. And the degree is broad enough to tailor it to your own interests, such as when I convinced my tutor to let me spend a week with my nose in the novels of Dostoevsky instead of some dry Russian mysticism that he'd originally intended. But unavoidably, this year I also had to spend a great deal of time reading some of the theological classics. There's a compulsory paper studied by all theology undergraduates at my university called The Figure of Jesus Through the Centuries. For this paper, I read the works of some of the Christian church fathers, who were the people who formed and founded the doctrines upon which the modern church is based, and some other high-profile thinkers too. And I kept stumbling across things that made me want to make a video like this one, detailing some of the fairly revolting ideas that I've been reading about. These classic texts I've been reading are fantastic for a specific reason. In the modern day, in modern theology and religious apology, there's a tendency to euphemize uncomfortable topics like hell and human depravity and unconditional submission to God. These things are talked about distantly and brushed over, skirting the edges, because it's recognized that they're a bit dodgy and that no one really wants to be told that they're a serf. But when these ancient tracts were written, there wasn't such a considerate sensitivity. These subjects are talked about here plainly and without sugarcoating, so it's much easier to see how truly awful they are. So I want to present some of these ideas to you here in this video, but do note these are all from the Jesus paper, so the content isn't particularly broad. In fact, I'll only be referencing 2 theologians in this video because they were 2 of the most central to this paper and I want to give them their due. But if you want to hear more about the contents of my degree, just let me know. Also, while the things I'm about to list are undoubtedly vile, my disgust lies with the subject matter, not the subject. I have nothing but praise for the way that theology is taught at my university, and I greatly enjoy it, and the faculty is commendable. With that said, here are some disgusting things from my theology degree.
I like the music.
Athanasius of Alexandria was a 3rd century church father who, if he didn't inspire the Nicene Creed, was certainly its greatest defender. This creed, or at least the version that's used in church services and recited every single week by believers, exists largely thanks to this man, who's been called the father of orthodoxy for his early defense of Trinitarianism against the heresy of Arianism in the formative period of the church. Athanasius is a titan of the formation of Christian doctrine. It's important to stress that when Athanasius was writing, the New Testament hadn't even been compiled and canonized yet. These were early days. There were no official dictums to refer to, no orthodoxy, nothing like that. This is the man who provided these things. It's difficult to overstate Athanasius' importance to the creation of Christian orthodoxy. In his most important essay, entitled On the Incarnation, he writes an extensive defense of precisely why God had to become a human being, why our sins need paying for, and why only a person who is both fully man and fully God could provide this. So then, what does this vital church father think is the basis for this unavoidably sinful state of humankind and need for salvation? Well, Athanasius states very plainly that Jesus died to resolve our state of corruption, itself due to the sinful nature that all humans inherit from Adam and Eve. Jesus came to, quote, settle man's account with death and free him from the primal transgression. This transgression rather obviously being Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, forbidden naturally since the church considers ignorance to be a virtue. Now, we now know, of course, the stories of Genesis to be based on nothing more than a mixture of original superstition and plagiarized mythology, but we're at least expected to take the metaphor of the fall of man as the basis for the original sin we're all supposedly born with, this being the reason we need salvation. So consider what we're actually being sold here, the unthinkable concept of inheritable sin. Inheritable moral responsibility, this of course being the basis for that other kind of superstitious idiocy that is racism. The idea that you can have a moral character and value ingrained in your DNA by virtue of the crimes of your forefathers, which, by the way, they never actually even committed. There was no first man, there was no fall, and there is no basis for this concept of original sin.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting topic, and I wonder if he'll get into it from Augustine's perspective, because St. Augustine talks about how original sin, the mechanism in which it is passed on, and the mechanism he kind of points to is this idea that original sin passes on from generation to generation through the act of intercourse. So it is the the semen itself that passes on the sin, because the action itself is sinful and semen is seen as sort of sinful, which is something that sort of Augustine kind of talks about. And so it's definitely a kind of a weird topic when you really break it down, but Augustine was really avid about kind of breaking down the mechanism at which original sin works, which I would agree with Alex here is kind of a weird and gross kind of theological take, but it's a take that pretty well most Orthodox churches today hold to. You don't have to hold to the idea of original sin, but pretty well everyone does. So it's it's definitely an interesting one. So we'll see what exactly he has to say about this. Also, Jared, I saw you mentioned your study was on Abishag. Yes, I love it. Abishag's an interesting character in Scripture. So she is basically the one that comforts King David. She originally pops up as a comforter to King David, as a virgin who comes to comfort King David and stays a virgin, is what Scripture says. And so sort of her faithfulness to do that. And so, yeah, that's kind of a deep take. I also mention her a lot in my conversation with Kip Davis, where we talk about the succession narrative, which is the stories that sort of led up to King Solomon becoming king in Israel, and how that's actually linked to a passage in Genesis chapter 38 about Judah. And so basically the idea is that this story about Judah and like his sort of sons and them marrying and stuff, and then him later marrying his own daughter-in-law Tamar, really wacky story. Definitely check it out in Genesis 38, how that is actually linked, and it's considered to be political propaganda from the house of Saul, or from the house of Solomon. It depends on how you interpret it, but it's basically political propaganda in order to show that, you know, things are not actually how they actually played out as represented in the Bible. And so Abishag shows up in that succession narrative, and then Genesis 38 is sort of the propaganda saying, hey, what you're hearing in the succession narrative isn't the full story. There's another side to the story, and we see that in Genesis 38. So it's definitely an interesting video. Definitely check it out. But sorry, I got a little bit off topic. I love that you guys are studying that. So cool. But here getting back on topic, original sin. It'll be interesting to hear his takes on original sin. And if you're liking this, give this video a like. And if you're not subscribed, feel free to subscribe. Let's hear the rest of what Alex has to say.
But for how many years has this invention been used to justify the concept that we human beings are in a state not just of mere transgression, but of total corruption? And not only rapists, murderers and the likes, but everyone. Children, from the moment of their birth, well, the moment of their conception, there's another Christian sticking point, are in a state...
Yeah, it's total depravity is what he's getting at. It's kind of in Calvinistic circles where they believe that, you know, basically salvation is given to you by God, right? You can't choose to salvation. You can't choose to have Jesus be your savior, but instead God sort of gives you the faith to then choose. We're so deprived. We are so in a state of sin, and it starts from original sin, but we're in total depravity that we can't even choose salvation. And from the moment we're born, we are utterly sinful. So it's that kind of idea.
State of corruption, deserving of unimaginable torture in an infinite series of punishment in hell. I mean, have you ever heard of anything more cruel and disgusting? And thanks to Athanasius, who grounds the entire necessity of Christ in this concept of original sin, it will never be something that Christianity can throw off, let alone apologize for, since he believed that Jesus came precisely to solve this condition of humanity. More specifically, Athanasius writes that Jesus came to resolve what he calls the divine dilemma. This dilemma is the conflict between two things. On the one hand, God created man with infinite life and happiness in mind, but on the other, he ruled that the price of sin must be death. This means that when Adam and Eve committed the primal sin, God had to stay true to his word and condemn us to that death. The dilemma is that God designed us to achieve eternal life, but he can't go back on his word, so death must be paid nonetheless. But if we die, it's an insult to God's prescience, because he may as well have never created us in the first place. Yet if we don't die, then God would be going back on his word. It's a tough spot. This is why Jesus needed to come in order to pay the price of death on our behalf. Being fully man, he could pay man's price of death, and being fully God, he had the power to resurrect himself, restoring eternal life. Ergo, man pays the price of death, yet man also achieves eternal life. the dilemma is solved. And the way Athanasius writes suggests that we should be celebrating the fact that Jesus offers a solution to the dilemma, which, I'll remind you, is a dilemma of God's creation in the first place. I mean, we're expected to be grateful, to show thanks. How could you be so merciful, O Lord, as to offer me a chance to escape your punishment for that crime that not only did I not commit myself, but nobody ever committed, and to offer it through the torture of a pseudo-pacifistic and sexually repressed human being by crucifixion? Thank you for affording us such class and such grace. Of course, Athanasius writes later in the book that the reason Christ needed to die such an embarrassing and torturous death is because he needed to demonstrate victory over all death, not just death in its most noble forms. But again, who was it that decided that death should be the punishment for eating of the tree of knowledge? Who was it that created man without the prescience that he might have given in to such a temptation? The very existence of Athanasius's divine dilemma relies on the fact that it was God who dictated these things. It's because God decreed death as punishment for original sin that this death must be fulfilled by Jesus. And remember, Athanasius is the father of orthodoxy. He wrote the book on this stuff. Every single week, the creed spoken aloud by churchgoers is indebted to his ideas, which have irreversibly embossed themselves on the doctrines of the modern church. C.S. Lewis referred to him as an obvious genius whose intellectual prowess makes itself immediately apparent in his writings. He's venerated as a saint by both Eastern and Western churches. This isn't just some obscure Christian polemicist. This is one of the most important figures in the history of the church. Look, teach this stuff to your children if you wish, but don't be surprised if they start yearning after their own death. As Athanasius writes that we should celebrate Christ's victory over death, a victory which is evidenced by the fact that young boys and girls, quote, train themselves to die because they're so excited by the prospects of what follows. I must say though, I won't be teaching this stuff to my own kids.
Yeah, so kind of to recap what he was saying there, I think he makes some valid points. I definitely would hear that a lot when I was a believer. This idea that, like, hey, you should be thankful that there is a way, that, you know, God provided a path to salvation because he could just have created it so there's no path to salvation. In fact, we all deserve death and destruction. But I think the thing that people miss is that, you know, God didn't have to create. God could have avoided that. God didn't have to create this dilemma either of you know, needing people to have sinned. You know, an example he kind of gives often in later talks is the idea of cancer treatment, right? So like we see chemotherapy and cancer treatment as a good thing, right? It's a good thing. Just like the idea of salvation in Jesus is a good thing. But are we going to say that that is preferable? That's better than not having cancer at all? That no one ever had cancer, it was never a thing, it was never created. Are we going to say that we want to create cancer in order to create treatment to cancer, in order to have that sort of good? That doesn't really make sense. And so in this scenario, why have sin in the first place if it's going to lead a lot of people, majority of people, to eternal punishment, depending on your theology? There's debate on all of those things, but in most circles, it's eternal punishment or annihilationism, right? So why create this dilemma in the first place? And I think that's a good question. It's a good point. So love that. Now we'll hear from Anselm. Very famous, Athanasia and Anselm. And if you guys are liking this, give this video a like, give it some hearts. Helps it get seen by more people. Also, if you saw the thumbnail, if you look at the beginning of the video, the first video I reacted to was a video in response to Rationality Rules, where Alex sort of breaks down morality and his perspective of morality as subjective, whereas Rationality Rules, a fellow atheist, sees it as objectively so, that morality is an objective thing. And so he kind of breaks that down, and as a group, we kind of voted. We think that Alex did debunk Rationality Rules. But if you have something else to say, if you would agree with the Sam Harris's and with, you know, Stephen of Rationality Rules, then let me hear your thoughts on that as well. But let's get back into the video we're talking about right here. as we continue to discuss theology as taught by Oxford University.
Okay, let's fast forward to something a little more modern, but still suitably old and fundamental. Anselm of Canterbury, of ontological argument fame, and also once the archbishop of that city, was an 11th century monk who, like Athanasius, is a crucial theologian within Christianity, himself a saint and a doctor of the church. Anselm is another towering figure in the theology syllabus at Oxford. You might best know him for his philosophical argument that God is the greatest conceivable being, and since a being that exists is greater than one that doesn't, God must exist. But Anselm was also the author of a famous tract entitled Cur Deus Homo, or Why God Became Man. Anselm essentially sums up his view on why God had to become a man. Remember, the very centre of Christianity, in chapter 10 of the first book of Cur Deus Homo. Anselm presents the following three considerations, all of which he believes to be true. First, man was created for happiness. Second, that no one can attain happiness unless his sins are forgiven. And third, that no man passes through this present life without sin. So, all men sin, and no man can attain happiness if he's still in his sins. Yet God created us for the very purpose of attaining this happiness. And so from this we can conclude that we require salvation from our sins in order to attain what God intended us to. This is how Anselm seeks to prove the necessity of Christ without assuming any knowledge of Jesus or the Gospels. For him, it's a matter of necessity. It's here that Anselm begins to discuss the nature of sin and where things get a bit murky. Anselm appears to have been inspired by Athanasius, or at least his thinking, since there are noticeable parallels in their works, but Anselm is more concerned throughout Cur Deus Homo with the concept of justice. According to Anselm, to sin is, quote, nothing other than not to render to God what is due. That's from Book 1, Chapter 11. Just what we owe him, he explains, is a subordination of our will to God's. Thus, sin is characterized as a kind of theft, since when we sin, we steal from God something which is rightly his honor. And yet, Anselm also, seemingly contradictorily, writes that it's impossible for God to lose his honor. That's from Book 1, Chapter 15. Now what this means is that since every person sins, and sin steals God's honor, but God's honor can't be stolen, this theft of sin, this debt, must be repaid, not as a matter of mere morality, but of logical necessity. God is the very meaning of justice, and so anything that contradicts justice cannot apply to him. So if we steal his honor, it must necessarily be repaid. So then, how can this debt of sin be repaid? Remember, Anselm says that everybody sins. Well, by sinning, we take what is rightfully God's, his honor, so the debt is repaid by God taking from us what is rightfully ours, our happiness, which you'll remember is what Anselm thought God created us for. How is our happiness taken from us? Why, of course, through eternal punishment in hell. This hellfire, quote, constitutes the satisfaction which every sinner is obliged to make to God. The problem is that we also require some compensation. Anselm here uses the analogy of imperiling someone else's safety. If we do this to someone unjustly, we can't repay them by simply restoring their safety. We should also provide some compensation for our wrongdoing in order to restore justice. Similarly, we can't simply return God's honor to him. We have to pay some kind of compensation. Anselm's fictional conversational partner in the book, called Boso, replies here that he does compensate God. He fasts and prays and makes self-sacrifices. But Anselm points out that these things are owed to God already. In fact, there is nothing a person can do that he does not already owe to God, to whom all things are owed. So what can we provide by means of compensation to pay for our inevitable sins? Well, nothing. It's all a bit hopeless, really. This is why we need a saviour to pay the price of death on our behalf, yada yada, Hosanna in the highest, Lamb of God taketh my sin away. What this means is that we can never pay this debt. And it's a debt that every person has simply by virtue of being born. Like Athanasius, Anselm also grounds our sinful nature in the myth of Adam and Eve. So we're forever chained to this condition, never being able to pay for the sinful nature that it's not even our fault that we inherit. The only thing that we can do is throw ourselves on the sacrifice of an innocent man and devote ourselves to his worship, because we simply have no choice in the matter. Of course,
That's a really fascinating idea. I haven't heard this perspective from Anselm, but the idea here is basically that, we are not just indebted to God, but that the fact that, we have sinned and transgressed against God means that we should not just do what he already just deserves to receive, right? It's not just doing what's necessary, but going above and beyond. And there isn't even anything we can imagine that would be going above and beyond. And so because we have inherited this transgression, and the only way to pay for it is to go above and beyond in our sort of actions and in glorifying God, the problem arises in that we can't actually do that. There's no such action that God doesn't already deserve to receive that is good. And so because of that, there's a problem. There's a debt that cannot be paid. So that's an interesting perspective. It's definitely one I don't think I've heard too much in church growing up, and it's a slight distinction on the normal kind of narrative. So yeah, what are you guys' thoughts on that? Also, Shaya, welcome to the stream. Good to see you.
The religious often press that we can choose whether or not to accept Jesus, but when Anselm says that we must necessarily be punished in hell unless we worship him, the choice seems somewhat forced. Again, a fairly revolting doctrine, don't you think? And Anselm really doesn't want us to underestimate the severity of sin, even in the case of minor sins. Here's something really telling. In chapter 21 of Book 1 of Codeus Homo, a chapter entitled The Graveness of Sin, Anselm asks Boso to imagine that he stood in the presence of God, and somebody tells Boso to look in a particular direction, but God tells Boso not to do so. Anselm asks, would you even consider looking in that direction? Boso realizes that, of course, he wouldn't, and he wouldn't even need to ask why. He can't just flatly contradict something God says whilst directly in his presence, after all. Very well. Well, Anselm now asks, what if it were the case that if you don't look in that direction, the entirety of creation will be destroyed? Boso says he still wouldn't look. In the presence of God, there's no way Boso could contradict God's command, no matter how trivial his transgression may seem, and no matter how severe the consequences seem. God's command must always be followed. Anselm then reminds us that we are always in the presence of God, and so this principle should apply universally. Just consider the implications of this for a second, both practical and theological. Practically, this instills the notion that it's virtuous to risk absolutely anything and everything in order to follow one's religious convictions. Will the world be destroyed if you follow your God's commands? It doesn't matter, follow them anyway. But also theologically, we're left with the implication that any sin, no matter how minor, condemns us to an unimaginable debt, which I'll remind you is impossible to repay. We also have here an equivocation between sins as trivial as looking in the wrong direction and the worst kinds of sins imaginable, since both are infinitely transgressive and infinity knows no bounds.
This is one thing I actually think is unique to Christianity that I think is actually it makes a lot of sense, which is the idea that like any sort of sin, no matter how big or small, will sort of damn you to hell, right? And from a human perspective, that doesn't really make sense because, obviously, lying in certain circumstances, telling or maybe just exaggerating the truth or something like that, or a white lie where you just don't say the truth. You don't really say anything that isn't technically false, but it's not technically the full truth. Those kind of things are kind of smaller, whereas, something like murdering someone or grape, those are problematic. Those are things that are big deals, and we would all agree like that's pretty big deal. Like we should probably, put that person in prison and, make sure that they're not affecting society. So based upon that, we can all, from a human perspective, we can see that that doesn't really quite add up. But if we were to say that a perfect being does exist, an all-powerful, all-perfect being exists, then it wouldn't make sense for the standard to be based upon humans, but the standard being based upon that perfection would make more sense because that's the basis of morality. That's the person who's judging things. And so if that's the case, then it does make sense for smaller sort of sins to actually have such a high weight, because from our perspective, they're small, but from the perspective of a perfect being, of a being who's never even sinned or even been able to conceive of themselves to sin, then that would obviously be something that's just utterly terrible, right? And so it would have that same sort of reaction. So it takes on the perspective of God in this conception of God, I think, really well. Which to me has been something that I think Christianity kind of makes sense with. Do I think it's a good thing? No, I still think it's gross and kind of problematic. But in terms of thinking about it logically, I think it actually does make sense if you were to say that a God like that does conceivably exist. So although it is gross, I think it's logic. It follows. It like logically follows, as long as the premise that God exists as a personal, perfect being, that does make sense to me.
What sound doctrine could equivocate these awful and fairly trivial sins and see them as deserving of the same punishment? I'll leave that to your consideration. And this isn't even to touch on Anselm's discussion of the morality of, think about this, the morality of punishing an innocent man, Christ, for the crimes of the guilty. This is something that doesn't seem to get enough reflection from critics of Christianity. Now, Anselm writes that God never forced Jesus to die. Jesus died of his own volition, his own choice. But Anselm also recognizes that there are a number of Bible verses that say that Jesus was doing the will of the Father. So how can this be squared? Well, Anselm says that it's not that the Father willed for Jesus to die, it's that the Father willed for justice to be restored, and that this justice entailed Jesus dying. Jesus had to follow the Father's will, and so this entailed him having to die. Now, you may ask, what on earth is the moral difference between the omnipotent Father willing something that entails Jesus?
I just saw the comment below. So was it? Yeah, Peter, you said to clarify why gross. And I think, are you talking about why I think that the idea of like original sin and the idea of like little sins having an eternal consequence in hell, like why I think that's gross? Well, I would argue that an eternal punishment for a finite crime is not really justice. I think it makes sense in the sense of like, who are you offending, right? You're offending an eternal and all-powerful God, right? So in that sense, it does sort of add up. But from a human perspective and how we think about morality from a day-to-day perspective, it's gross. It's like, are you really going to torture someone for eternity because they, lied to their brother when they were 6 years old? Like that doesn't seem to add up. That doesn't seem like true justice. And so I think there's other ways that you can explain hell that better account for that. But to me, that's where the problem lies. And that's why I think it's gross, because it's a infinite punishment for a finite crime. And it just kind of goes way overboard in that. Jewish law is eye for an eye, right? The punishment should match the crime. And so we see that kind of biblically in the Old Testament. But then when we get to the notion of sinning against God, we bring in this idea that all sin leads to the punishment of eternity in hell. And we also get the idea that there's such a thing as original sin, so that even if you haven't sinned, even if you haven't reached, say, the age of accountability, you are still dead in your sins. And so that's the problem, is that sin's not just a transgression you actively participate in, but it's also something you inherit. And so we all inherit the basically notion that we're all going to hell until we accept the gift of God. And so to me, I think that's why I think it's gross. I think it's just like so many people are going to be burning and tortured for eternity in this perspective for a finite number of crimes. It doesn't seem like true justice. That just seems like over-the-top vengeance, at least from a human perspective. So, no, I'd love to hear your pushback, though, but that's why I said that.
Jesus' death and willing Jesus' death itself? And, well, yeah, good question. I implore you, of course, to read the text for yourself and see what you make of it, but I think that the punishment of an innocent man for the crimes of the guilty, especially when such sophistry is used to defend it, should be enough to make anyone squirm. And besides that, I don't really want to carry on talking about Anselm any more than you want to carry on listening to me talk about Anselm, so I'll leave that as homework. And so, to summarize Anselm's views, we have to pay the price of eternal punishment for stealing from God what cannot actually be stolen from him, an act which we cannot help but do by virtue of simply being human, because we inherit the guilt for the moral transgressions of our ancestors we now know to never have actually existed. Okay, well, how on earth can we possibly escape this ghastly fate? Of course, by throwing ourselves on a Middle Eastern human sacrifice of a man who was not forced by God to die, but simply had no other choice but to do so, since he had to follow God's will, and God's will entails his death. But Jesus wasn't forced to die. No, that would be wholly disturbing. It was just that he was simply obliged to follow God's will for justice, which happened to entail him having to die. Moral perfection, I think.
He's getting into kind of free will debate here. Just because, like, could Jesus have chosen otherwise versus was it his choice, you know? So that's a different debate there is the free will debate, but I think he's kind of getting at that a little bit. So no, I don't know.
You'll agree, ladies and gentlemen, with only a hint of intellectual acrobatics, just for flair, probably, I guess. But anyway, there's a taste of what I've been dealing with for the past academic year. If you've made it this far, then, well, congratulations, and pity those of us who have to spend almost every waking hour in term time reading about this nonsense in the library. Now, if you want to know more about my experiences studying theology, I'll leave some links in the description. There are a few things that I've done, such as an article I wrote on the topic of studying theology as an atheist for a Christian magazine, as well as I've provided my university reading list on my website. And if this goes down well, I can always make more of these videos covering more of the material that we study. But this has been a nice catch-up. Now you know what I've been up to. You should expect more frequent content over the summer, and remember that I'm now selling brand new merchandise with brand new designs. They're all really cool. I'm working with T-Mail now. A link is in the description. I also have a podcast available on iTunes and Spotify, in case you forgot. I've got some really great guests lined up, so keep your eyes peeled. But with that all said, I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can find me on social media here. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.
Very nice, very nice. So that was disgusting things for my theology degree. I like his clarification. It's not that he finds the degree itself and the study and the practice of their study is gross, but it's more just that the content of early theologians he finds disgusting. Those specific topics are, I don't know, they're kind of weird and gross, especially when you get into, he didn't get into Augustine and the mechanism of original sin, but that's another one. Definitely look it up. It's a funky one. So, all right, it is time to leave a comment. Comment time. What stuck out to you guys in the video? Comment below. What stuck out to you? I think the notion of sin being seen as this sort of like stealing from God and giving back not just what was stolen, but also giving back more than that is a very interesting notion, and that the reason we can't pay back sin is because we would have to pay back more than what God is owed because of our transgression. But there's nothing that we could ever do that would be beyond what he has already owed because of how great he is. That's an interesting perspective. I mean, that's not really something that I think is taught a lot, at least in the churches I grew up in. But that's a fascinating one. So that was from Anselm. When you want to prove your point so much that you get a degree in what you criticize the most. Very nice, very nice. On a recent podcast, he actually said that people often like ask him the question, like, why did you get a theology degree? You know, why are you studying New Testament studies? Like, why is that such a focus for you? And he's like, you know, I can't really answer that other than I just find it interesting. And I feel you, man. I feel that. I find I think I find the Old Testament a little bit more interesting than the New. I find Gnosticism pretty interesting too, but I don't know. The Old Testament seems to have a lot more wacky stuff going on. So it's pretty cool. As a kid, I did want to die because I knew that if I died as a kid, you'll automatically go to heaven. Wow, that's crazy. That's actually something that Anil, I think, Armin talked about in the podcast that he did with Armin last week that we listened to on the stream. And that Armin, as a Muslim, he tried to end his life. He jumped out a window to end his life because he basically saw his life here as worthless. And in Islam, in the specific type of Islam he practiced, they had an age of accountability where, you know, you could go to hell when you reached a certain age, but prior to that, you were too young to make that decision. So he decided it's better for me to just kill myself now before I reach that age of accountability. And so that's what he did. And it's sad. It's very sad to see people kind of going to those lengths in order to avoid eternal damnation. Yeah, so that's a tough one. Atheists often get criticized for not taking the deep theological positions of theists seriously. But when you read this stuff as an outsider, it really does sound like Tolkien deciding why one wizard is more powerful than another and why you have to take a boat to get to Valinor. That's a nerd right there. He's definitely read the Silmarillion. Oh, man, that's great. I took a couple of theology courses in college, IIRC. All of my professors happened to be religious, but one of them said, as he was getting his theology degree, he asked a lot of his professors if getting their theology degree strengthened or weakened their faith. It was about 50-50% or 50-50 split, according to him. That's fascinating. 50-50 split. You know, I see those videos all the time where like people are like, getting my theology degree like caused me to lose my faith or something like that. That's crazy. I don't know. It's like, really? I don't know. I don't think that's obviously not the case for everyone, but the fact that it is the case for some people, I think it's probably people who come from fundamentalist backgrounds. I know this is true for me. Like if I didn't come from a fundamentalist background, I probably would still be a Christian in some sense. I don't know. But the fact that I, came from a fundamentalist background, it's so hard to separate Christianity from fundamentalism to the point where you just kind of are like, I don't know what to believe anymore. So I'm just going to, not believe all of it. So I don't know. I don't know what I would say, like how I would act otherwise. But in terms of all that, it's interesting. Dude, you don't know any of these. You're not a scholar. How can you say that? Alex actually gets a major in theology. It's not a major. He minored in theology, but I mean, he's studying it, which is important, and he continues to study it. So, Holy Kool-Aid. I love this guy. He's a cool creator. Fun history fact. During the 4th century, Athanasius competed in 3 consecutive Olympic Games and took the gold medal every time. That's crazy. Wow. For mental. Bro, I thought you were telling the truth there for a second. Bro just fooled me. I feel like an absolute fool right now. Gosh. I just got played. Wow. All right. Well, what shall we comment? Let me know in the comments below. What are the things that stuck out to you? What kind of comment shall we leave? Probably just a kind one, easy one. I think it was a cool hearing some of your guys' questions. So that was pretty cool. But in terms of what type of comment to leave, probably something about like it being cool to hear the inside scoop of the Oxford theological classes. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking. Something along those lines. What are your thoughts? Hmm. I'm like blanking on everything he said in the video. But probably something like this. Okay, this is what I put. It's cool to see you utilizing what you've learned from Oxford in these videos. Great job putting this one together. The idea of seeing sin as an obligation to pay back more than what we stole from God is a fascinating one. That's a concept I don't think I ever heard growing up in the church. We can't pay back sin because we would be required to give God more than he is already owed for being so amazing, something that does not truly exist, and thus we are stuck in our transgressions. Very interesting. Jared says brain fart. Yeah, I had a brain fart. It's a little bit smelly in the old noggin up here. I think I'm gonna full send it, unless you guys have any pressing issues that you would like added to the comment. Well, I think we have time for one more video. What are your guys' thoughts? One more video? One more video. One more video. But the question is, what is that video going to be? We shall see. I usually kind of plan out which ones they are. But this week, in this section, it's mostly just really long videos, like an hour and 7 minutes, 51 minutes. I'm looking for something like under 20 minutes. So yeah, all these are super long, very long, very long, very long. 20. Okay, so this is 2 minutes. It's from his longer podcast with Peter Singer, so we could do that. Arrested for offending Islam. That's an interesting one. Yo, is that the first Within Reason podcast? We're going to save that for later. That's so fascinating. That's so cool. So that's when he first rebranded. Dang, I didn't realize he rebranded that many years ago. He rebranded 6 years ago? Wow. So fascinating. So it was the Cosmic Skeptic podcast up until episode 9. Interesting. All right, I'm thinking we do you know what? I think we have time for this. Are you worth more than a tree? Dennis Prager of PragerU. Oh boy, PragerU. We could do that one. Evil and Suffering. He has some shorter ones there. Okay. I have decided. Let's do this one. And actually, this is a fascinating one because when I was a Christian, I remember when these videos came out. There was a number of videos discussing and responding to atheists that I saw as I was a Christian at that time. And I remember What Do You Mean? Mike Winger, I think Inspiring Philosophy also, Capturing Christianity. A lot of these guys were responding to these claims by atheists. And I saw their videos, but I never watched the full videos from the atheist perspective. So now it's time to watch it from the other perspective. So cool. So cool. All right, let's watch this one.
Build a website you love with Wix. For your words.
How's it going, everyone? It's Cosmic Skeptic, and I'm glad to be making one of my old-style response videos again. It's been a while, and I'm just in the mood for it. Just a reminder, I'll be speaking at events in London, Winchester, and Israel soon. Links are all in the description, of course. Now, the reason that I'm inspired to make a response video is that I recently came across an attempted defense of the idea that a loving God might allow children to get cancer that seems so flawed to me that I couldn't resist making this video pointing out why I think this. And for a long time I've actually been meaning to take on the problem of evil and suffering more generally and make a kind of long and comprehensive video discussing the topic. And I still plan on maybe doing so, but this particular attempt to defend a loving God allowing kids to get cancer screamed particular urgency to me. This attempt comes from a Christian channel called What Do You Mean, whose owner's name is John, and is part of a series in which John is responding to some arguments from the atheist Hemant Mehta. Now, I know John has made a response to one of my videos in the past, to my video about slavery, but responding to that will take some more time to prepare. I'm sure I'll get around to it eventually, but please do note that I'm aware of the video, just to prevent you from going off about it in the comments. For now, though, let's see where this discussion leads us. Should we believe that a loving God would allow children to get cancer? Well, let's hear what John has to say.
What argument do we have today that proves that God does not exist? What argument are we going to consider today that proves that God does not exist? Let's go ahead and hear it. Hit me. No, I meant hit me with the next objection.
Pediatric cancer.
Okay, that was a very short argument. Let's hear it again.
Pediatric cancer.
I think I got this one. So the argument is, because I can't think of any good reason why God would allow children to have cancer, therefore there couldn't possibly be a good reason, right?
Wrong, actually. That's not necessarily the argument Hemant is going for. Clearly, Hemant is framing the argument rhetorically, so it's hard to know precisely what his version of the argument is. But we have to note something important here. Hemant is, of course, bringing up what's known as the problem of evil. The famous question, how can evil exist if there is a loving God who is all-powerful? Now, crucially, something John fails to acknowledge is that the problem of evil comes in two different forms: the logical problem and the evidential problem of evil, as they're generally known. Now, failing to distinguish between these two types means that he might be responding to a totally different argument, not the one being made by Hemant. So we need to understand the difference between these two versions to really understand which version Hemant's making and whether John's criticism of the argument holds up. So in order to understand the difference between these two versions of the problem of evil,
the important distinction is that the philosophical problem of evil deals with the idea that it is philosophically impossible for evil to exist if an all-powerful and all-good God exists. Most people reject that notion. And so to sort of argue against that is to basically straw man most people who are atheists and are atheists because of the problem of evil, because they're generally atheists in regards to the problem of evil through the evidential, which is not as big of a claim. It's not that it's conceptually impossible for evil to exist and an all-powerful, all-good God to exist, but that based upon the observed evidence in the world, it is unlikely that an all-powerful and all-good God does exist because of evil. And so it's more of this sort of evidentially less likely kind of notion rather than it is absolutely impossible. That's not the claim being made, because that's a claim that would be very difficult, and actually I think not even, you're not going to back that claim up, because there are great examples that you can use. Something like working out. We would consider the pain and suffering of working out to be something that would be bad against the well-being of the individual. But the overall well-being of the individual shows that working out actually is a good thing. And so you can allow for the suffering of working out in order to get the benefit of the greater good, which is the strength that you receive or the cardiac ability that you receive from something like running and things of that sort. So that's kind of the distinction between the two. And to basically argue against the logical problem of evil is to usually straw man the other side, the other perspective, because you don't recognize the evidential problem of evil.
We have to first get to grips with the difference between two broader categories of arguments in general: inductive arguments and deductive arguments. In inductive arguments, the premises point towards a conclusion, offering evidence to support it, but don't logically require that the conclusion must be true. In deductive arguments, the conclusion does logically follow from the premises, such that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well. Well, here are two examples to help explain. First, a deductive argument. Premise 1, all cats are black. Premise 2, Tom is a cat. Conclusion, Tom is black. As you can see, the conclusion logically follows from the premises. There's no way in which the premises can both be true and the conclusion be false. Of course, the premises can be false, as they are here, meaning the argument isn't sound, but that doesn't affect its logical validity. It's deductive because if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So when it comes to deductive arguments, they can only be debunked by arguing that at least one premise is false. By contrast, and for comparison, here's an inductive argument. Premise 1, all cats that have ever been observed are black. Premise 2, Tom is a cat. Conclusion, therefore, Tom is black. As you can see, this is a very similar argument with an identical conclusion, in fact. But this conclusion is not logically required by the premises. It's perfectly possible for both of the premises to be true and yet the conclusion be false, which you'll remember was impossible for a deductive argument. And that's the difference. Now, the thing to note is that inductive arguments aren't bad arguments for this reason. They can be incredibly convincing. For instance, consider a very similar argument to the one I just presented. Premise 1, all tangerines that have ever been observed are orange. Conclusion, all tangerines are orange. The conclusion doesn't logically follow from this premise. It could easily be false, since we might discover a uniquely purple tangerine at some point in the future. But if you do believe that all tangerines are orange, as most people do, then you're convinced by this argument, even though, logically speaking, the conclusion could well be false. So,
Have you guys ever heard of purple bananas? This kind of reminded me of it. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard this before, that bananas used to be purple and that they've changed to be yellow. I might be talking out of my ass right now, but I feel like I've heard. I'm going to look that up real quick. Have you guys heard that before? Let me know. Let me know in the comments below.
In a deductive argument, the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. And in an inductive argument, the premises support the conclusion and offer evidence in favor of it, but don't logically require it. I'll leave some more information on the difference between these types of arguments in the description. But with that understood, let's unpack the two forms of the problem of evil, which are generally known, as I say, as the logical form and the evidential form. The logical problem of evil is a deductive argument, which, as we've seen, means that it claims that if its premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. The logical argument goes something like as follows. Premise 1. If an all-loving, all-powerful God exists, evil would not exist. Premise 2. Evil exists. Conclusion. Therefore, an all-loving, all-powerful God does not exist. Now this is a fairly surface-level version of the logical problem of evil, but you can see it's a deductive argument. If both of these premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Those who support the logical problem of evil, therefore, believe that they can prove that God does not and cannot exist. So now we can talk about the other version, the evidential problem of evil. The difference with this is that the evidential problem is inductive. Instead of claiming that it's logically impossible for a loving God to exist if evil exists, it claims that it's unlikely, or not a good explanation of the evidence available to us. It doesn't logically follow from the existence of evil that God does not exist, but we should consider evil to be at least a good reason to doubt God's existence. This is in the same way that all observed tangerines being orange doesn't prove that all of them are orange, but it provides good reason to believe so anyway. So now consider Hemant's argument.
Pediatric cancer.
Which version does it seem that he is presenting? Well, it seems to me that Hemant is getting at the evidential problem of evil, the inductive version, because his example, pediatric cancer, is an example of severe and powerful suffering, but doesn't reference logical inconsistency. Instead, it seems that Hemant is just providing a good reason to doubt that a loving God exists. If this is the case, then when John says,
So the argument is, because I can't think of any good reason why God would allow children to have cancer, therefore there couldn't possibly be a good reason.
He's actually characterizing a completely different argument, the logical problem of evil. This is because John's version of the argument is one in which it's impossible for there to be a good reason for suffering, not just, as Hemant seems to be suggesting, that it's unlikely. So the argument presented by Hemant needn't be that it's impossible for a loving God and evil to both exist, as John seems to suggest, but rather that extreme and apparently unnecessary suffering is a good reason to at least doubt that God exists, which is a different argument. Christians will often make what's known as a cumulative case for God. They present a number of inductive arguments in favor of God's existence, such as the design argument, the fine-tuning argument, the historical argument.
Sorry, this is a little bit off topic. He mentioned the tangerines and I had to look into it. So this article talks a little bit about it. So what did bananas used to look like? Uncovering the history. So if you ever wondered what bananas used to look like, here it is. Have you ever stopped to consider what bananas used to look like? Sure, you may see them in the grocery store or in the kitchen every day, but have you ever wondered what the history of this beloved fruit looks like? From their original form to bananas we know today, uncover the fascinating journey. Bananas have been around for centuries and their shape and size have changed over the years. So I don't think it's just purple, but there's like red and other variants. Unlike the plump yellow fruits we find in the grocery store today, the original bananas had an elongated shape, firmer texture, and thicker skin with prominent ridges. Additionally, they had a nuttier flavor rather than a sweet taste of modern bananas. In the past, these ancient fruits were only found in tropical regions such as Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. They were also cultivated by ancient civilizations and have been found in archaeological sites in Egypt, India, and Central America. Today, thanks to processes known as hybridization, modern bananas are much larger and have more rounded shape. The process involves crossbreeding different types of bananas to create the desired characteristics, resulting in the large yellow sweet bananas we find in stores today. So far it doesn't mention anything about the color. Bananas have been around for centuries. Let's see. Sorry, I just wanted to look at this. I feel like I've heard this before. So it seemed to be firmer. I mean, to me that sounds a little bit more like a plantain, but a plantain is larger than bananas, whereas this is saying that they used to be smaller. So it's like a small plantain, I guess, kind of vibe. Is there anything to do with the color? Here, we got Control F. Let's see what Control F has. Purple, here we are. Wild bananas also have a limited variety of colors, typically being green, yellow, or purple. What? We don't really have bananas growing here, so this is new. The yellow and purple varieties weren't as sweet as the green variety, which, I mean, green isn't abnormal. That's kind of like an a super ripe fruit sort of thing. Domestic bananas were developed through the process of hybridization, where different species crossbred to produce a new variant with desired characteristics. The yellow and purple varieties weren't as sweet as the green variety, which wasn't as popular among humans as it was too difficult to peel and eat. Very fascinating. I gotta get there's pictures I saw. Let me see if I can pull up the pictures. Yeah, so these are the pictures. Are these real? Is that real? Purple bananas? Look at that. That looks kind of real. I don't know. It was saying that there's a purple variant of banana. So, oh, here's the red. We got red too. Sorry, y'all. This is a tangent. And then it's more seeded. Yeah, they were mentioning that too. It's like firmer, a lot more seeds. That's so fascinating. You know, we can just change the color through processing them. Hybridization. The hybridization process. Sorry. That was a bit off topic. I had to look it up, though. It was so fascinating. All right. Now back to childhood cancer. That was a rough pivot. Anyway, let's hear what else they have to say.
Argument. And whilst none of these arguments on their own completely and deductively prove God's existence of their own accord, collectively they make a strong case in favour of his existence. Well, similarly, we can make a cumulative case against God's existence, consisting of many arguments, while none of the component arguments, like the problem of evil, themselves completely and deductively disprove God on their own. The evidential problem of evil is one good reason to doubt God's existence. It can appear in a cumulative case against his existence, but it doesn't make it impossible for him to exist. So I think that John is actually mischaracterizing the argument, at least the version that Hemant is presenting. So then, if we interpret Hemant in this evidential inductive framework, the argument being presented is really as follows. The fact that apparently unnecessary and cruel suffering exists among the innocent is a consideration that should count against the claim that an omnibenevolent and all-powerful God exists, since if such a God does exist, there are few reasons to believe that such suffering should exist, and many reasons to think that it should not. Crucially, this is an inductive argument, not a deductive one. It's not the logical problem, it's the evidential problem. So consider the syllogism presented here by John.
Because I can't think of any good reason why God would allow children to have cancer, therefore there couldn't possibly be a good reason.
I can't think of a good reason for kids to have cancer, therefore there is no good reason.
I'm grateful for many things, and talks-based therapy is one of them. Because Adam and
Well, this isn't right for the evidential case. We can allow that there may well be a good reason for suffering to exist, but that it's just more rational to believe that there probably isn't. I'll explain with an example. If I saw a man beating his wife in the street, I'd like to think that I would intervene, or at least wish for it to stop. Why? Because I can't possibly fathom a reason to justify his behaviour. Does that mean that there definitely is no such reason? Of course not. I can't prove that. Maybe she asked him to do it. She might be a masochist. Maybe the couple is trialing an experimental form of New Age medicine for a nasal infection. It's not impossible that the beating is in some way justified. The point is that, given what I do know about the situation, it seems most rational to believe that this beating should not be taking place, and that there isn't such a reason to justify it, if you see what I mean. Look, I can't deductively prove that there isn't a good reason to justify the man beating his wife. Again, this is just an inductive inference I'm making. But it still seems like the rational position to take. Now, based on what we've seen, John might well turn this situation into a sarcastic syllogism too. He might characterize it as, what, you're saying that because I can't think of a good reason for this man to beat his wife, there can't possibly be a good reason? How ridiculous, that doesn't logically follow. Well, no, it doesn't. But not every argument is one of logical necessity. This is an inductive argument, and a good one at that. It's possible that the man is justified in beating his wife, but that's surely not the rational position to actually believe. It's possible that children getting cancer is actually some kind of blessing in disguise, but that doesn't make it rational to believe this either. So look, John, we're not saying that there is definitely no way that cancer in children can be justified, that there's no good reason for it to be occurring like you seem to be suggesting. We're just saying that it seems rather unlikely.
Now, believe it or not, and I'm genuine when I say this video is actually a breath of fresh air. And the reason I say so is because the last two videos that I did in this series were not clear at all. It was pretty hard to see how it led to, therefore God does not exist. But in this video, it's a lot easier to understand. The argument is basically because God allows children to have cancer, therefore God does not exist.
Well, no. Obviously, the conclusion can't be God does not exist if one of the premises is God allows suffering, since he must exist to allow suffering. Again, this is just a confused syllogism. I'm sure John knows this, of course, he's no fool, but when dealing with intricate philosophy, we have to be precise in our language. Luckily, John is about to charitably steel man the argument, putting it in its strongest form just to make things harder for himself.
As usual, and because I'm somewhat of a nice guy, somewhat of a nice guy, then I'm going to go ahead and make this argument better than it actually is in its current form. The argument in its strongest form that I'm aware of would be something like, if God exists and he's all loving, then he wouldn't allow bad things to happen to innocent children. Bad things happen to innocent children, like children getting cancer. Therefore, God cannot exist.
In fact, what John has done here, which I hope you'll now be able to notice, is not just made the argument better, but shifted from the evidential problem of evil that Hemant was probably making to the logical problem of evil. Now, I'm happy to engage with this, of course, and I'm about to.
I mean, I would also say, to the credit of what do we mean, to John, we don't know the motive of the argument. Maybe he was arguing in favor of the logical argument. And while I would agree with Alex that most of the time people use inductive reasoning when talking about the problem of evil, because that's just a lot easier to defend than a necessary logical perspective of the argument. We don't know what type of argument he's using. So I think it's just as valid for him to critique the logical argument here, because he doesn't present the argument in any sort of great way. I mean, it's a very sarcastic argument, mostly just for rhetoric's sake rather than for logical sake. But I think it stands. You guys are on even ground here in your critique versus defense of the argument. Until the guy can actually say where he was coming from in the argument, there you can't really say too much. But I would say it is reasonable to probably assume it's an evidential one, but you can't say that for sure.
But do note that this may well not be the argument that Hemant was originally presenting at all.
There it is. Okay.
Now, I'll defend the logical problem of evil here in this video anyway, since I'm not exactly doing this for Hemant's sake, but it's just something to bear in mind. So let's take John's new formation.
So he's going to defend the logical problem of evil. Well, that'll be interesting, because I don't think you can. We'll hear what he has to say, but I don't think you can defend that notion.
Of the argument.
If God exists and he's all loving, then he wouldn't allow bad things to happen to innocent children. Bad things happen to innocent children, like children getting cancer. Therefore, God cannot exist.
This is perhaps close enough, but again, we have to be precise. it's vitally important to include another, sometimes forgotten premise, that God is omnipotent. This is usually assumed, but let's be specific. Now we're dealing with an argument of logical inconsistency. We essentially have 4 propositions, and it's claimed that they cannot all be true at the same time. At least one must be false. The claims are as follows: God exists, God is perfectly good, God is all-powerful, and evil exists. Since most conceptions of God think of him as necessarily both perfectly good and all-powerful, the most common of these propositions to reject out of the 4 are claim 1 and claim 4. And since evil seems self-evidently to exist, we've all experienced it after all, the only one left to reject is the proposition that God exists. So why can't these claims be consistent? This requires some...
One thing I will note, there are a lot of scholars who believe in God, or I should say theologians, who believe in God, but reject the idea that God is all-powerful. And so that's not fully accepted by every theologian. There is a lot of people who think that God is limited in his power, and those are pretty fair arguments.
Further clarification. The claims don't necessarily contradict each other unless we make some hidden assumptions clear. Perhaps the most famous essay ever written on the problem of evil is J.L. Mackey's Evil and Omnipotence. A link is in the description, you can read it online. It's essential philosophical literature. So these hidden assumptions that I just mentioned, in Mackey's words, and I'm quoting, "These additional principles are that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do." From these, it follows that a good, omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and then the propositions that a good, omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. So there is what is probably the actual, strongest version of the argument, or at least the most famous and most abided by, with all the premises laid bare and fully explained. The most compatible. So there is what is probably the actual, strongest version of the argument, or at least the most famous and most abided. This probably thing exists.
Okay, I wasn't fully paying attention. Okay, let's read this real quick. So the argument is as follows: these additional principles are that good opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there is no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. For these, it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and that the proposition that a good opponent or omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. So I think where I would probably disagree is with that first notion. These additional principles are that good is opposed to evil. I don't think that's true. I think there are moments when greater goods are achieved through some sense of evil or some sense of suffering. So that's where I would probably disagree with this, is that you can have suffering for greater goods. And so allowing for that is not in opposition to good. In fact, it's in, It's in the benefit of good. So, I mean, I gave the example of working out. I don't think that's the best example. What's a better example? A better example would be, I think John gets into this a little bit, but a better example is basically this notion that, like, when you go to the doctor or like the dentist and you get like a filling, right? The idea of going to the dentist and getting a filling is to benefit you, right? So that the decay that will happen, that will continue to occur, no longer happens. But when you go in and you get that filling, there is a sense of pain and suffering that you incur. But that pain and suffering is worth the greater good of no longer having that cavity, right? Maybe another one would be, learning a lesson through hardship. Like you learn something unique and you become stronger as a person through hardship. So that's an evil, or that's a suffering. That's a bad thing that you incur in order to receive something good, in order to receive something, better. So, oh, hi, Harry. I'm sorry. I just saw your comment. Welcome. It's really a knowledgeable topic. I'll watch the full video. Yeah, definitely. It's pretty in-depth one, is the problem of evil. Good to see you, man. Good to see you. So, but with that kind of notion is this idea that, wherever evil exists, wherever bad things exist, good cannot exist with them, or good cannot exist as a result of them. I reject that. I don't think that evil is always in opposition to good. And so while you can say that, and this is what this John Mackey here is saying, I don't think that follows. There are examples in which allowing for evil and allowing for suffering in some sense actually produces other goods, produces greater goods in certain senses. And so things like bravery, things like, self-sacrifice, like Jesus on the cross, self-sacrifice, that's something that we see as a really great good that would not exist if evil didn't exist. And so, while I would be in favor of the inductive evidential argument for evil, these are examples that I think show that evil is not always in opposition to good. And so you can't say that it is deductive entirely. So I would reject that.
And that evil exists are incompatible. So there is what is probably the actual strongest version of the argument, or at least the most famous and most abided by, with all the premises laid bare and fully explained. With this covered, let's see how John responds.
All right, story time. So for those that don't know, I have the most incredibly adorable 2 baby boys on the entire planet, right? Right now they're 5 months old and 4 years old. And I just love my boys. When it came time for me to take my oldest boy to the dentist for the first time, I did what any dad would do. Rather than putting him through torture and having him hate me,
So the dentist example, I probably subconsciously just remembered this video from years ago. So yeah, he uses the dentist example here. Perfect.
Told my wife that she had to take him. So when that didn't work, I ended up at the dentist's office sitting there with my boy. And as usual, the dentist comes in and the dentist tries to make him happy, tries to make him laugh. And he just was not having it. He was just terrified of the dentist and would not chill out for a second to let the dentist start looking inside of his mouth. So at this point, he starts screaming, he starts crying, and he starts reaching for me. And instead of me reaching for him, grabbing him, and taking him from the dentist, instead what I had to do was actually hold him down so that way the dentist can continue to look inside of his mouth. Not only could he not understand why I didn't save him when he's reaching out for me, but he also couldn't understand why I actually held him down and allowed him to suffer. And for me, it was really kind of difficult at this point, to be straight up with you. And the reason why is because I wanted him to understand, but I knew that there wasn't anything that I could say that he could understand. I mean, he was barely, kind of getting through basic language at this point. He just couldn't understand the language or even these big concepts of the greater good. Now, in a similar way, I don't see any reason why it couldn't be the same with God. If God created the entire universe and he knows everything there is to know, then he would also know how everything must go together for the greater good, even if we couldn't see it or comprehend it. And just like my son, who was too little to understand the greater good, how much more would it be for an infinite God that knows literally everything? Therefore, we couldn't possibly know all of the reasons for why God allows suffering to happen.
So we're essentially dealing with a best of all possible worlds approach here. John is clearly claiming with this anecdote that an explanation for suffering in the world is that God allows some evil because that evil is necessary to eliminate a greater evil, thus serving some greater good. Now please note there are many other ways in which the evil is necessary for good argument can be made, but I'm going to respond specifically to John's version as presented here in this dentistry story, since he doesn't offer any others. So the argument is, evil is possibly justified because it may eliminate or prevent greater evils. In the dentist story, it's clear that though the child does suffer in the dentist chair, the reason for this is because that suffering is necessary to prevent or to fix the greater suffering of toothache or some other dental problem. That is the philosophical crux of the story. But bear this in mind. The only reason that that child's suffering at the dentist's can be seen as a positive or justifiable thing is by virtue of the fact that some greater suffering like toothache exists. In other words, if there were no such greater dental pains, then there would not be this reason for the child to suffer at the dentist's. So, according to John's analogy, this means that human suffering, e.g. kids with cancer, can be justified or good by virtue of the existence of some greater suffering which this small suffering is needed to eliminate.
That's a really good point, and I kind of mentioned that earlier with the concept of cancer and stuff too. So I would agree with what he says here, but I think what this misses is not just like avoiding greater bads, but allowing for bad and evil and suffering in order to achieve greater goods, which he doesn't actually bring up. He's just talking about greater evils being avoided rather than greater goods being achieved. This would be something like bravery. So for instance, like you now have the ability to face things that are rough and sort of run into the fire theoretically and overcome fear, right? Or maybe a greater resiliency, right? Maybe it teaches you to, not take things for granted, but to be appreciative of what you have and what is in life, right? Without suffering and pain, these greater goods could not be achieved. And so that's what I think is really at the bottom of this. It's not that the greater evils being avoided, which is the suffering and pain in having a cavity, but it's actually the I guess maybe with this analogy, like the trust that you gain from your parent, or maybe the what's a good way of understanding this from this analogy? I guess it would also be like the ability to realize that, oh yeah, I actually can do this. I can overcome this. And I have this sense of like pushing on through what's difficult. I don't know, with the dentist analogy, if there's like a really good example of that, but I think generally there's this idea of like bravery and, self-sacrifice. Those are sort of greater goods that can be achieved through suffering and pain, that would not be able to be achieved through it otherwise. People even say love, like true love can't be had unless you understand pain and suffering. So, I mean, that's another perspective that you can hold to. So we'll see if he addresses those things, but those pop out to me. I don't think evil and good are always in opposition to each other. So that's why I reject the logical, deductive problem of evil, but I do accept the inductive one. I think it is evidence in favor of God probably not existing.
Can you see how we've just pushed the problem back? The question simply becomes, why should such greater suffering exist in the first place to necessitate the lesser suffering? Or if you'd rather frame it the other way, why would God construct a world in which evil is necessary to ultimately attain good? Imagine John's child could understand complex language, and John explains to him that he needs to suffer at the dentist's because otherwise he'll suffer from the greater pain of tooth problems. Now, his child could completely accept this, but then ask, very justifiably, why this other pain of tooth problems should exist. John would either have to reference some even greater suffering that the tooth pain helps to counter, offer a completely different account for suffering, or shrug his shoulders. So the idea that God allows some evil because it's necessary to eliminate greater evil, as is the case in the dentist story, is not a sufficient explanation for the existence of suffering overall. It only allows us to explain individual cases of suffering, and then only by referencing other cases of even worse suffering, themselves needing an explanation. I can't say this is really winning me over. And this isn't even to mention the fact that John's dentist analogy, of course, severely limits the omnipotence of God, that pesky forgotten premise from earlier. And it doesn't just limit his omnipotence in the obvious sense, but in two ways. Most evidently, it means that God is incapable of eliminating great evils without permitting smaller evils. But if God is truly incapable of this, then he's not omnipotent. But the second and less obvious way in which John's analogy limits God's omnipotence is in God's explanatory power. This is to do with the part of the analogy which suggests that As the child can't understand that a greater good is being served by the dentist, we can't understand that a greater good is being served by pediatric cancer. Sure, a father might not have the capability to make his child understand why dentistry is ultimately actually a good thing.
Quality at unbeatable prices?
That's a really
Yes,
good
chef.
point.
Horse duvers.
I like that.
It's an
makes
oldie
sense.
thing.
But surely God, who, as John points out, is infinitely more powerful and knowledgeable than our father or our dentist, could easily make it known to man why his children getting cancer is actually something to celebrate, since it indicates a greater good at work. But if, as John's analogy suggests, we truly cannot understand God's motives here, it follows that no explanation from God could help us on that front, meaning God's explanatory powers are limited, meaning he is not omnipotent. Now, like I say, there are many other ways for the religious to defend the idea that evil is necessary or that it's consistent with a loving God. I'm sure this isn't John's only response to the problem of evil. He seems far smarter than that. But it's the only one he's presented here, and I wanted to respond specifically to this dentistry analogy that I find utterly bizarre. The idea that a child getting cancer might be necessary in the same way that dentistry is necessary, because they both prevent some even greater suffering from occurring, has a long way to go before it's even naive. If John has the power to make things better for his kid by taking him to the dentist, of course he'll do this, even if it necessitates some small amount of suffering. But if he had the power to make it unnecessary for his kid to go to the dentist at all, he'd surely do that instead. If he could eliminate the greater suffering that makes the lesser suffering necessary, he'd do this. The same must be true of any loving God. Either he can't, so isn't omnipotent. He doesn't want to, so isn't benevolent. He doesn't exist, or John needs a better argument. Which of these is the case, dear viewer, I leave to your consideration. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can find me on social media here. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I'll see you in the next one. Very nice, very nice. Yeah, I mean, he kind of addressed it. This wasn't like a full-fledged delving into the problem of evil. I don't think he fully addressed the topic super well here, but he does address this one specific argument, and I think he does a good job at that. The notion of greater goods, right, being achieved through suffering and pain, through evil, I think is really the main kind of argument people use. That's the real steel man of the argument in favor of suffering allowed by an all-powerful and omnibenevolent God. So, yeah, no, it's a good response to that specific video, but not a very good response in general to the problem of evil. So, but now it is time to leave a comment. Comment time. Let me know, what are your thoughts on that as well. And if you're just tuning in, welcome to the stream. So far, I haven't been counting. I think this is number 21. And then for us together, it's 23. So if you're unfamiliar with this series, I am watching every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet. Thus far, I have watched 121 videos on my own. Together through these live streams, we have now watched 23 videos. Woohoo! Come on now. So that's very exciting. This series today, we mostly talked about debunk. Basically, did Alex O'Connor debunk Rationality Rules, a fellow atheist YouTuber, on the idea of objective morality from the perspective of an atheist. It's basically Sam Harris, like Rationality Rules. Stephen of Rationality Rules adopts a morality that's based on kind of Sam Harris's perspective of the moral landscape, where morality is a product of evolution, and it basically stems down to this idea of well-being and all of that. Anyway, Alex rejects the fact that it is objective because he thinks that there's an is-ought fallacy going on, where we are designating what we observe to be true, what is, and saying that it ought to be that way, that there are moral facts rather than just moral beliefs that just happen to be the case, and it could be different if things had played out differently. So necessarily true versus not necessarily true. So anyway, that's a bit of a recap on this live stream thus far. And for this video, we responded to his notion of would God allow kids to get cancer, pediatric cancer. So we will comment that. Let me know your thoughts below. What are some of the things that stuck out to you? What shall I leave in this comment? I think the main things that kind of stuck out to me is kind of the notion of, well, the banana notion, but anyway, the thing that stuck out to me probably the most is the idea that that like in the analogy with the dentist chair, it restricts God. It's a restriction on his omnipotence. Basically, God cannot explain to us why suffering happens. And so that's sort of the restriction. Although I think one thing that's kind of just come into my mind, maybe that's part of the greater good to be achieved, is if he explained it rather than you realizing it. That might be the distinction there. Welcome, John. Welcome to the live stream. I just finished a video discussing, the first one was debunking, so you can see that at the beginning. The one that we just listened to is would God allow kids to get cancer? And he was responding to John of what do we meme? The basic idea behind it all is whether evil and good are in direct opposition to each other, or whether evil can exist with good, and that sort of evils can exist to create goods that would not exist otherwise. So that's kind of the idea, the greater good sort of thing, because of evil, things like bravery and the sort. So anyway, now it is time to leave a comment on the video. I think the example brought up is a good one to kind of introduce people to the idea of allowing evil, but it's not a good one to explain it away fully. I think it's a problematic example that he gave with the dentistry example. And like he said, it shows a lack of omnipotence, which is a premise within the argument of the problem of evil. That's a very important one. I think oftentimes people argue in favor, like against the problem of evil, assuming the sense of like restriction from God, which is just, that's part of the argument itself. It's one of the premises of the argument. So it's something you can't really ignore. It could be one of those things where without one, you wouldn't recognize the other. That's also a good point. I mean, that's something that, what is it? Sorry, I don't mean to do that. Frank Turk brings that up too. He brings up the problem of good, I think is what he says. Basically, like, you wouldn't know good from evil without good. And so there's a problem with good, because in a materialistic world, you wouldn't expect there to be a notion of good and evil. You would just be expecting a notion of what is. I reject that. I think there's good reason we can think that there would be good and evil in the subjective sense of the word, but without evil, you might not be able to recognize good or the degree to what is good. Yeah, I would agree. There seems to be a degree of things being good to great to even better, like amazing, you know. That's why we would say God is holy, because he is ultimately good. He has no blemishes. He has no evil to him. And so that's the sense of being holy and beyond anything that is human in nature. So, yeah, those are really good points. Thanks, John. So with this, it is comment time. Okay, this is what I put. I said, I think the example John gave with the child in the dentist chair was a poor example. Great job breaking it down. Question: do you hold to the logical problem of evil or the evidential one? I think the logical one is problematic since I can think of sufferings that produce greater goods that would not exist without without the sufferings. Think bravery or contentment. Yeah, bravery, self-sacrifice, contentment. Those are kind of the ones that often get brought up. But yeah. Let me see if there's any other things to be added. Yeah, there's also, like you said, John, the notion that you can't really recognize good without evil. And so I guess good would then just be, it wouldn't really be a thing, but it would just be like what is, you know? So it would be less of an ought and more of just like, this is how people act. Period. End of statement, you know? So maybe that's really what it is that like if in a world without evil, good is just, it's not even a thing, but it's just like what is. It's a thing in that like people act according to the good, but there is no acting outside of that. And so that's kind of why that's the case. Also, I just realized my thing froze. Let's see. Let me pause that. That's weird. My animation's frozen. I don't know why. I'll have to check that out later. Anyway, that seems to be the main comment. So I think I will leave that as it is. Well, guys, it has been great streaming with y'all tonight. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for tuning in. This was episode number 9. Next week is going to be episode number 10. So that's going to be pretty special. Coming up, I have a lot of things I want to add to this kind of live stream on a weekly basis. So you can kind of be looking forward to those things. I was thinking it'd be fun to do a bingo card. So I can add like a little bingo card with some of the kind of main things that Alex kind of often brings up. It would be things like different analogies. It would be things like topics that he often talks about. So when he mentions these certain things or these things show up, or for instance, like one I was thinking about is also like in the background. For instance, right here, that little wooden subscriber button that a friend of his made for him. Like that's something that pops up in some of his older videos. So it'd be something that we can put on the bingo card. If we see it, we're like, oh, there we go. Check it off on the bingo card. So I was thinking that'd be fun. So you guys can definitely look forward to something like that. Good and evil are all subjective. For example, slavery was something that wasn't considered a sin. A lot of Christians use the Bible to justify slavery. Nowadays, the idea of slavery is abhorrent. Yeah, that's very true. Slavery is not condemned in the Bible. Not really ever. People have to use sort of other arguments outside of like the Bible specifically saying that slavery is bad, and more just kind of like general kind of truthful kind of moralities that come from the New Testament to show that that slavery's not a good thing, which you can use, but I would also say it's not super strong. But yeah, I mean, subjective in that sense, I would agree. So I think C.S. Lewis brings up witch burnings. There used to be people who would burn figures that they thought were witches in the past. And, now we view that as bad. Back then, they would have seen that as protecting their community. And so there is that sense. He argues in favor of kind of undergirding core values behind it. So we're looking, in that sense, he would say we're looking at the product of objective morality, but interpreting situations incorrectly. So there is an objectively good way to view and act in that circumstance, but because of misinformation, people acted poorly, even though they still had the sort of inward desire to do that which is good. They just misinterpreted the situation. So there's those kind of arguments. I don't think those stand because, well, it assumes a lot. It assumes basically that there are these things that ought to be good, and we can't really say that there are things that ought to be good. They just functionally work, and maybe there's other ways that would work otherwise, but we don't know because we just happen to have inherited this morality through the evolutionary process. So that's kind of my main thought on it. So yeah, no, great stuff. Really great stuff. Anyway, next week we will be getting into some more of his podcast stuff. He talks a bit about veganism coming up, so that'll be something to look forward to. Is his talks on veganism. So make sure next week to tune on in to his discussion on veganism. Did I miss the video of Alex with Rationality Rules? I'm sub to all three of you. Yeah, that was the first one. So if you rewatch this, it'll still be up, so you can watch the rewatch. That was the first video. I can pull it up real quick here if you want to watch it on your own too. Oh, wrong. Let me pull up the old videos. Yeah, so it's basically he debunks the morality perspective of it all. So in Rationality Rules, here it is. Rationality Rules, Morality Debunked. So basically he breaks down what Rationality Rules says about morality, the perspective that he holds to, as well as Sam Harris, is this idea that morality is objectively true, right? Whereas Alex holds to a subjective concept of morality, and it gets to kind of what I was saying earlier, which is this is-ought fallacy. Alex says that Rationality Rules is making an is-ought fallacy by saying that, because we have these intrinsic ideas of what is right and what is wrong, and that we all share these ideas, like I should survive or I should take care of my children, these kind of deep things that we all hold to be true. That doesn't make it absolute, an ought. That just makes it a description of what is. We hold to the belief that, looking after our children is a good thing, but that doesn't automatically make it a good thing. In order for it to be a good thing, it would have to be necessarily true that in every possible world, it is good to take care of your children. And you can't really make that point because we don't know that. We can think of a situation in which maybe it would be evolutionarily beneficial to not take care of your kids. I don't know. But that's kind of the notion, is he's saying something that is a notion we all hold to, and then concluding that it ought to be that way, that we hold to that belief, when it's just what we believe. It's a description of what we believe. It's what is. Anyway, you can watch it and you'll kind of see more of what I have to say. So anyway, thanks again, y'all. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your night.